So, yeah. Hello everyone. Today I wanted to open a discussion around the subject of PISPs, fintechs, and their use of the 3PPI interface and the AISP 2.0's API, and what that means around open banking and similar issues. So this was sparked by a discussion that came up in the ISO 222 work stream a couple of weeks ago, because we're looking at ISO 222 for payment initiation, transfers, etc., etc. And we looked at the use of ISO 222 for PISPs, and it was highlighted that for a lot of the PISP functionality, ISO 222 is just not applicable. And so the idea of migrating all of Mojaloop PISP services to ISO 222 is simply meaningless. Instead, that space is largely occupied by open banking APIs, and we're all aware of open banking and the APIs that are in existence. There isn't actually much of a standardization that's happened in that space. I mean, a lot of organizations have their own definition of open banking, and nonetheless, there has been some what's the word, standardization on approaches. Open banking organization in the UK, for example, and there are a few aggregators of PISP functionality certainly in Europe and North America. So there are probably things we can learn from there. But the question then comes up, well, why should we bother? Well, because after all, fintechs can connect directly using PISP 2.0. Well, the reasoning I want to test is that although PISP 2.0 is a great flexible API and a lot of work on it has gone into it, it's not the easiest to use. So the suggestion is that we look at the approach that we've taken with connecting DFSPs using Payment Manager or an SDK to ease the use of FSPIOP to offer a fintech connector, an open banking API, to make using PISP 2.0 easier, and which would also handle issues of security and certificate management. So if I just share my screen for a moment, I just wanted to show you something that I put together the other day. This is an interpretation of what we currently do for connecting DFSPs. Well, actually, it's an evolution of what we currently do, as we migrate into an ISO 222 world. So in ISO 222, a Mojaloop hub will accept transactions in the form of ISO 222 messages. And that will not be the only interface, because there's also what is currently known as an admin API, but it really isn't an admin API. It's a participant management API. Participant self-management API. We can argue about the description of that later. And separately, there's a need to set up the connection between the DFSP and the Mojaloop hub, and we do that through security and certificate management, etc. So there are three distinct interfaces, one of which is the ISO 222 messaging. So we currently offer an SDK. In fact, you'll often hear us talking about Payment Manager, PM4ML as it's also known. And part of the Payment Manager is this SDK. And in ISO 222 world, there will be these three boxes which manage these three interfaces into the Mojaloop hub. And for what security and certificate management is a little different because it kind of underpins everything, part of every transaction. And then on the left-hand side, we have what we have historically called the core connector, that which connects the DFSP's core banking system into the Mojaloop the Mojaloop world. And the purpose of this is to make the use of the connection into Mojaloop much more simple for an adopting DFSP. In the ISO 222 world, it may be that connection is via ISO 222 messaging. As of today, the connection is really via some core banking system protocol based on the existing infrastructure within a bank. Thus, that will notionally evolve to ISO 222. So that's my view of where we are now, or will be very soon, in terms of DFSPs and ISO 222. Before I go any further, does anyone want to make any comments on that? I don't want to turn this into all preaching to the room. I want this to be a discussion. So does anyone have any comments on that?
Hello, Paul.
Hello.
Hi, Mohammed here. Just so I understand, when the SDK is communicating to the Mojaloop hub, what you're mentioning is that we use both ISO 222 and other native APIs for the participant management.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is how well, at the moment, this bit, which is ISO 222, is FSPIOP, and it will be evolving to ISO 222 messaging.
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
At the moment, this uses the FSPIOP protocol.
Okay.
It will be evolving to ISO 222.
Understood. So then what you mentioned is that the ISO 222 on the core, on the Mojaloop hub is still work in progress for now.
Yes.
Yes. And we're using native APIs.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Is there any other comment? No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Paul, Alan here.
Hi, Alan.
Yeah. Hi. So just to clarify here, so right now what we are seeing on this diagram is basically how this connection is implemented within the payment manager only. So we don't have independent components that can be used, right?
No, that's correct. I mean, within payment manager, we have essentially, I know this is simplifying it, but there is the SDK with extra pieces on the side. I just wanted to focus on the SDK for the moment. And to simplify things, we have the core connector, which connects into the DFSP, and there is a separate simplified version of these three. I'm oversimplifying, I know, and I hope that people won't complain too much. But there is what we call a Mojaloop connector, which is analogous to the SDK, which connects between the core connector and the Mojaloop hub. But this is part of Payment Manager. It doesn't have to be. It can actually be used separately from Payment Manager.
Yeah, that's what I was alluding to, because right now, as you know, we're implementing this switch for our switch, right? And kind of have an independent core connector. And this the reasoning behind this was that most DFSPs in Rwanda were already going to adopt ISO 222.
Yeah.
So we had to move very quickly on that one. And the ISO 222 that is in use here is a flavor that will probably not be what you end up implementing within the overall Mojaloop core connector, right? And then what leads to my question then here would be, since we are talking PISP and obviously right now our switch is looking at using open APIs to connect
Mhm.
to PISPs and.
Well, we will come to that in a moment, Alan.
Oh, okay. All right. So
yeah.
I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry about that. So please
Racing
carry on.
ahead of me there, Alan. Yes.
All right.
I was just
good.
trying to establish
Thanks.
a baseline here.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Apologies.
That's quite all right. Yes. This ISO 222 implementation into a core connector is work that you have already done in Rwanda. I'm aware of that. But this side historically has been FSPIOP, and this is the migration that is currently in process. Does anyone else want to say anything else before I move on?
So, Paul, not here.
Hi.
Hi. For the if I've understood well, the core connector, since we are implementing the connector in Rwanda, after Mojaloop is done with the core connector, will we need to move from the current connector to core connector, or we don't need core connector since we've already implemented it?
If you're already implemented and already using it, I don't see
One, come again?
I don't see why you would need to move to change.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we'd probably need to explore that a little further before making a definitive decision. All right. But yes.
Okay. So when it comes to ISO 222, maybe I think Alan has alluded on it. Today we are building a connector which one side talks ISO 222, the side which interfaces with the current PSPs. Another side, it's translated the ISO 222 to IO protocol. So if you implement the ISO 222 on Mojaloop Hub, will we have to change that translation to ISO 222 or the Mojaloop?
Okay, that's probably the subject of a different workshop, Nari. But to give you
still have a backward compatibility.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to say on that. That's probably the subject of another workshop, Nari. But I'll give you a quick answer, but more detail I think we probably need to take separately because it's a big question that you're asking me. This moving to ISO 222 does not remove the requirement for the SDK, because the SDK also does stuff like setting up the participant relationship with Mojaloop, for example, which you can't do in ISO 222, and also manage the security of the connection into the Mojaloop hub. So again, that's not something you can do in ISO 222. So the SDK does not go away with the migration to ISO 222. In terms of a message that comes here from the DFSB, a message initiating a transaction, that may well be a simple pass-through here, if you can see my pointer. But that assumes that the ISO 222 flavor here, which has been adopted in Rwanda, is the same as the ISO 222 flavor that is adopted here. Now, you may well know that the Mojaloop community, the Mojaloop Foundation, has been in close contact with the ISO 222 organization to review the ISO 222 message schemas that are available. And this has been highlighted that these schemas, as they are currently available, do not meet the requirements of an inclusive instant payment system, such as Mojaloop. So we have been working with the ISO 222 standards groups to define a schema for inclusive instant payment systems. They have accepted the messaging schema that we have defined with them. It's currently in draft, and we expect to. We've been given the blessing of the standards group to use this new schema on the assumption that it will be adopted as part of the ISO 222 community in the coming year or so. And that's the schema that we are implementing. So, Nari, that's a big subject, and we can address it in a separate product council session focusing on ISO 222, or actually I'd encourage you to join the ISO 222 workstream and be directly involved in those discussions.
No problem. I'll be happy to join.
Okay. You would be very welcome, believe me.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on now. So we then take that model there and we try to apply that into the fintech connection. So as you know, in the Mojaloop world, fintechs connect directly into the Mojaloop hub, not into individual DFSPs. So the fintech only needs to integrate once, rather than separate integrations with each DFSP. So the suggestion that I want to open up today is that we take the lessons that we've learned around SDKs for DFSPs and look at an SDK for fintechs. And the fintech would again benefit from 3 connections into the Mojaloop hub. And here, I think I very much want to lean on the expertise of Paul Baker, who has defined the PISP 2.0 API. But following the same model as before, we have an ISO 222 connection into the Mojaloop hub, which is for things like request to pay, initiating transactions. And it may also, as indicated here, be extended to support the complementary protocol to PISP, AISP, account information. And that's not something that's currently in the APIs, but it's could relatively easily be extended to support it. And that's something else that I want to explore today. Separately, we have an admin connection, which supports the association between a fintech, or more precisely, a fintech's customers and their accounts at DFSPs. So authorizing the connection between a customer through their fintech into the DFSP and the DFSP account. And then we still have a need for the security, the certificate management piece to manage that connection. So it's connection setup and management. And then instead of a core connector, we have a fintech connector, which connects to fintechs via an open banking API. So there are big issues here, I think. First off, the first big one I can see is, would it actually work? And separately, we need to define this open banking API because there is not a standard on this. We need to explore the various open banking APIs that are currently in existence and select something that meets our requirements. And it would probably be best to base it on the work that's been done by various aggregators, for example, in this space. And also, I'm very well aware that there are many banks in countries that we are currently operating in Rwanda, in Kenya, and elsewhere, that already have their own APIs, and perhaps we can learn from those as well. And separately, we need to think about the functionality splits between the admin portion and the ISO 222 portion, bearing in mind that open banking is not ISO 222 at all. So how do we in the fintech connector orchestrate that relationship between admin functions and ISO 222 functions and translating them into the open banking API? So that's kind of an opening statement on this. So I'd very much welcome any comments that anyone has on this. And do we think it's worthwhile pursuing this? Or is actually exposing simply the PISP 2.0 API to fintechs the best approach? rather than going through an SDK. Comments from the floor very welcome. Okay. There's nothing.
Yeah.
Go on, Alan.
Question. Yeah. So to just circling back to the question I was about to ask earlier. Now, if we are looking at this fintech connector, does it reside? Is it an opportunity to have it reside outside of the payment manager at the moment? And
Yeah,
then
I
be
don't think this has
used
anything to do with
independently
payment
of
manager.
the payment manager.
Yeah, I think it's.
And
I think
if
all
so,
such questions are entirely up in the air. Nothing here has been defined.
Oh, okay. So we don't have this PISP SDK implemented yet.
No.
Oh, okay. All right.
And I'm asking, I'm asking
before.
today, well, asking today, is it worth devoting resource to this? Paul, you're coming in.
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. There is a version of it. SDK scheme adapter for third parties. When they did the original project, they definitely had a supportive SDK.
By original project, what are you referring to, Paul?
The PISP version 1.
Uh-huh.
There is something in the space already, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right. But it would need extensive modification to support both ISO 222 and the AISP 2.0.
Agreed. Yeah.
Paul, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sam.
Can I come
Yeah.
back to you? Can I come back to you in a moment? Sam, James got in first.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah, just for clarity, when Paul Baker is absolutely right, during the PISP version 1 project, when the hub endpoints were implemented to support PISP, they also built a version of the Mojaloop SDK that supported those interactions from a DFSP perspective. So that that's kind of a combination of the blocks you've got on your screen there of admin and ISO 20022, even though it's the FSPIOP version of API, and not ISO. So there is some code out there that exemplifies how to do it, but it's compatible with the PISP 1.0
And
protocol.
certainly not ISO 222.
Correct.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
This is an idea that's been tried, though.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm going to come back to you on that in a second, Paul. But Sam, you were talking.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Even in version 1.01 aspect I wanted to touch on was there is a need to support the PISP or because we are using that term now, open banking calls on the DFSP side as well, because Mojaloop does it in a way that that DFSPs and PISPs or third-party providers are directly connected to the switch instead of going through the account holding institutions.
Yes.
So,
I was assuming that was going to be through this participant management piece here.
actually, those will be transactional calls. So it's possible. It's possible that it falls under that bucket, the ISO 20226. That's the
isn't it in two parts, Sam? Because there's the setting up of associations, etc.
Yes.
And authorizations, etc. before you actually do a transaction.
There is some linking, but there is an authorization endpoint that we also use, which kind of falls in the FSPIOP API as well. So a combination of those two. Yeah. I wanted to highlight that we need support, not let's say if a scheme wants to support this use case, we need support on the DFSP side as well, was the bigger point.
Yes. And if I unite them both into a single diagram, there is a need across both SDKs in this case, yes. Mohammed, did you want to say something?
Yes, please. Do you have other slides coming, Paul? Or
No other slides coming. It's just a discussion from here, and I'm capturing notes.
Thanks. So I think for the what is it? The Open API banking APIs. I think it's for the definition part that is fine. But there's an issue, and Alain, if you allow me, I don't know if you briefed the team on our discussion before, where we have a situation where we need to integrate aggregator to the switch, and what this aggregator provides services, and what this aggregator is going to do a payment initiation to the DFSPs, and then we have the financial transaction. Now, the discussion we had internally was that we were of the view that we expose JSON APIs to these aggregators that they can use for the payment initiations. And then the DFSPs, when they do the credit transfer, they can use ISO 222. Now, I'm not quite sure how that will link to the Open API banking, because we are not managing any consent in this case. You initiate a payment, and then the DFSPs actually ask the user whether to approve or reject it. It's a one-time approval without any consent. So we just want to get your view on this, basically.
I personally don't. I'm not sufficiently well informed to have a view on that. Does anyone else have a view?
I think some of those models have been discussed over the previous few years. I don't think there's any firm conclusions about the way Mojaloop should think about those things, but it's certainly worth having an in-depth discussion, I think, about the particular use cases that you have in mind.
Mm-hmm. Somebody else? Mohammed, please come back on that, please.
Yes, so the use case, if I can explain on a high level, is we have a service aggregator that doesn't have any stored value accounts.
Yeah.
But what they do is that they collect money. So it's a request to pay in that sense. Yeah. So they collect money from consumers. Now, what they do is that they send a request to pay to the switch. We identify the payer DFSP and then send a request to the payer DFSP. And then the payer DFSP prompts the user to approve the payment. If the user approves the payment, then we do the standard, cash transfer.
So, but that's payment into the aggregator. You say the aggregator doesn't have an account.
Correct.
So where does the money get sent to?
So what the aggregator does is when they send the payment initiation, they will include both the creditor and the debtor of that transaction.
Right.
So in there, they'll specify the receiving account and the receiving financial institution.
Yeah. To me, that model is essentially this one. That's the aggregator acting as a fintech, if you like. So the fintech does not have an account in this. They do a request to pay from the customer account to the destination account, wherever that might be. So I think that's entirely supportable by this, but that's not a bulk solution. That's a one-by-one transaction solution, if that makes sense.
Correct.
Yes. Well, that's entirely supported by this model. Yes.
Which model?
By the model presented here. By an open banking API.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So let me ask it this way. Now that we're still defining the open banking API principles, and we are not managing consent, are we free to choose a JSON schema of our own choosing and then expose this to the participants, to the aggregators, and then have the transaction go through?
You mean here, define your own API?
Correct.
Essentially, a JSON schema.
Correct. Yes.
Well,
yes.
At this moment, yes, but it would be more effective for us all, I think, if we could agree on that definition and standardize it across Mojaloop deployments, so that we can all benefit from the work rather than repeating the work multiple times. I would hope that we could work with you, Mohammed, to define that API so that we can all use the same one. Does that make sense
Yes,
to you?
that's fine.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Nare, you wanna say something on this as well?
Yes, Malim. I think you've said it all. Maybe my question will be on fintech connector. Is it part of? Can I call it? Is it a standalone payment manager which can be deployed?
It's not.
Is it, come again?
It's not a payment manager at all. It is as yet not defined. The purpose of this meeting today was to agree or to disagree that this is something that is needed. So therefore, if the feeling of this meeting today is that this PISP SDK is something that is needed, then we can initiate a work stream to actually carry out that definition work that you are talking about, Nari.
Okay.
We can't define that today, but we can, if we can agree that that work needs to be done, then we can start that work.
Yeah, I think that is clear, but in my point of view, yes, it is needed because as Malim rightly puts, there is aggregators down there which will obviously need to provide overlay services, which connecting using ISO 222 would be very complex to them. So having an open API or an open backing management system in between the core system and the fintechs, it's very paramount to the quick adoption. So yeah, in my point of view, it's really needed.
Yeah.
Maybe architecture can discuss later, as you've rightly said.
Yeah, I think that if we follow the model that was used, with the DFSP SDK and core connector, then it will be that the fintech connector is something that can be modified according to the needs of a particular deployment. So I think there should be some flexibility about that, but I think there is value in us as a community trying to define the open banking API at least in outline, rather than just leaving it open and undefined, because the danger in that is that it would not support the functionality that's needed for to support the PISP in this way. So we should do our best to define that open banking API as much as we can, I think. Alan?
Yeah, just to add to what Nari was saying, I think there is also going to have to be a requirement, at least for the deployments here, to have the fintech connector live outside the secured networks, right? So I think here we are talking about the fintech connector residing in the DMZ, right? While to allow for fintechs accessing this open banking API via the public internet, and then eventually from the DMZ connecting to the Mojaloop hub, either via ISO 222 or FSPIOP.
I think these three would very clearly have to be in the secure zone.
Yes, correct. Yes, and then the top one outside.
And then the fintech connector in the DMZ.
Yep.
I think that's probably. I think, God, my view is that it can be in the DMZ, but I'd take advisement from James and Paul on that one, I think.
Which is where I was heading. Maybe if we conclude to have it in DMZ, then it will need to be a standalone out of the system, right?
I think it would be standalone in any case, but if it is a requirement that it be in the DMZ, then we need to make sure that we design accordingly. And since we're at the initial phase of this, then we should be able to take that in as a constraint that it can exist in the DMZ. Mohammed?
Yeah, question for me. So today we do have an API gateway, is it? And where does that sit? Does it sit on a DMZ, or will it sit? Or will the fintech connector be embedded on the API gateway?
I have a suspicion it'll be embedded in the API gateway, to be honest with you. Sort of straddling the DMZ and the secure zone. Paul?
Yeah. I've seen lots of deployment diagrams of this, and the fact that it's a separate component means that exactly where it is deployed and what it looks like can be flexible. So I've definitely seen diagrams and models where that is deployed in completely different infrastructure, and I've seen it when it's deployed in and right alongside it. I think both models work. What is important though is that it fits within the domain of the fintech themselves, because the security certificates belong to that connection. So the fintech needs full control, and no one else really can have control of that PISP SDK box. I think that's a critical piece. The exact deployment topologies can be very flexible.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Paul, to emphasize that there's a one-to-one relationship between this and this. That this isn't intended to support multiple fintechs in this case. If you have multiple fintechs, then you have multiple SDKs.
I think there is a multiple tenant solution that is possible. But then effort needs to go into to make sure that only that particular fintech has got access to the certificate store that is available. So, but essentially it's the same thing as what you've said, Paul. But I have seen a design for a multi-tenant version of this that meets all the security requirements and keeps the domain separate.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just making notes.
Yeah, the most important thing is the end-to-end non-reputability guarantees between the DS.
I think whatever we come up with has to support that as a core constraint.
Yeah, as long as that's maintained, then there's an awful lot of freedom, I think.
Yeah. Alan.
Yeah, I would also, want to say that at least in this context here, this fintech connector will most likely have to be multi-tenant, right? So you will have to be supported as a central connector from the switch side, and then have multiple fintechs basically connecting to it, which means that the certificate authority in this case will our switch. Right. So pretty much all the fintech would have to make their signing request to our switch, and then yeah.
Okay, I mean that's part of the point of this. That's a clear requirement for Rwanda. So we need to make sure that we take that into account within the work stream. James, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, Alain. I think we should probably discuss that in greater detail. I think maybe some of the naming and labeling on these diagrams is confusing.
How dare you?
Sorry, Paul. Open banking, in particular, that where you've got open banking API between the fintech and the SDK,
Yeah.
the top right of the diagram there. It's interesting because I think what we're saying is that the hub itself exposes open banking APIs in the form of the PISP 2.0 API, right?
Yeah. It's about simplifying it.
So that's really the open banking API. The hub exposes that there. So I suspect, Alain, that you're thinking the hub needs to be the thing that exposes the open banking API.
Yes, that's exactly our thinking here.
Yeah, I thought so. So the PISP 2.0 API there, yeah. I don't think there's any reason why you couldn't define the shape of that by having a wrap around it in the way that you explain. That you probably wouldn't need all the complexity then of what's in that PISP SDK box.
Essentially, that would say that this is not actually going to add any particular value.
Well,
actually we should just expose this.
Or are we saying that the shape of the PISP 2.0 API that the hub is exposing, if that's what we're trying to expose as an open banking API, then the shape of that API is wrong because it doesn't look like an open banking API.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
I do entirely see what you mean. And that, what you've just said, James, is what I was trying to achieve through this.
PISP, the reason for the PISP API was pretty specific, right? It's quite a, well, I won't say it's a narrow use case. There's lots of use cases, but it supports the notion of a third party initiating payments from some other third party to some other third party in the scheme.
Yeah.
And open banking, I think, is much broader than that.
Yeah.
Am I right? I don't know a huge
amount. It is. Well, it could be said to be much broader, but it could be said to be very narrow as well.
Okay.
And I think that part of the motivation here is to make it really easy for a fintech to just say, make this association now, issue a request to pay for me, send money from here to here, and do away with all the management, etc. And partially it's the fact that we want to start to implement request to pay using ISO 222 messaging, which is not part of the open banking API either. And Julie, your comments about it being different from jurisdiction to another, that's absolutely true. Doing a bit of basic research comes up with all sorts of definitions of open banking. But I'm hoping that over the next few years, we will standardize on it. And if you look at the definition from the EU, essentially, and the definitions of AISPs and PISPs, I think is a good starting point for us.
So is it worth then, Paul? Do you think we should have some focus sessions on the section that we've got there at the moment there? Let me see if I can just annotate on here. If we did some focus sessions on what this API looks like from a perspective of open banking, we might come up with some notion of what Mojaloop open banking API should look like.
Yeah, I think that was going to be my ideal outcome from this meeting. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So then we might have to change our mind about what an SDK might look like.
Yeah. I'm very much open to that. That's what I was hoping to achieve out of this. Yes.
You're good. It's almost like we read each other's minds.
Entirely. Paul, you've been very patient. Please
Um,
go ahead.
Yes, just something Elaine said, and I might have misunderstood Elaine, so but I would like maybe some clarity on it. If if there's a multi-tenant that needs to be hosted in the hub, let's say, for multiple fintech connections, that in my mind doesn't mean that the hub needs to sign the messages. I think that can be done in a way where the fintechs can still sign them as long as they have independence of the security models. Because if the hub signs them, then I feel like we've lost our end-to-end non-repudiation.
Yes.
I think I used the wrong word there, but non-repudiability. So
I think you're right, Paul. Yeah.
I think
So-
you're right. I think that's a really important point. Yes.
So I would like to see a multi-tenant version of this that, in fact, can maintain that by allowing the individual fintechs to still sign their messages.
I think what I meant was the certificate, the SSL certificate being pretty much R-Switch being the signing authority for the SSL certificate. As when it comes to signing the message individually, of course, these are signed by the fintechs themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
If we are implementing, digital signatures here for these open banking APIs. So what I meant was who issues the SSL certificate, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
That is the central entity, which in this case would be R-Switch.
Okay, that
Right,
makes
sense. But signing the requests individually, of course, this is remains the prerogative of the individual DFS. Fintechs.
Okay, great.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad we cleared that up.
Pleasure.
I'm glad
Thanks.
we're all agreed on that. It's rather a core principle. Yes. Okay, good. Nare?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, my question here, view that we are in initial initiation and definition of the scope of this. And as you understood in our questions, we are having already a use case on hand. If we move with what we have today, do you see any conflict in future when you standardize, or will you be open to follow what we've implemented? What would be your advice on this?
Sorry, I don't understand really. Can you repeat the question? I don't think I understood what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I'm saying since we are having already a use case or an aggregator who want to a PISP who want to connect through basically the fintech connector, and we are pretty we want basically to deliver it as soon as possible, and looking at the architecture we are designing today looks like we are on definition of the scope.
Yeah.
If we move with what we have today, the API, which is a JSON, which Malim has already pointed out here. If we move with the JSON published Open API, and of course JSON published out to fintechs and get translated to ISO 20022 when it reaches to connectors. So if we move with what we have today, do you see any conflict when you will start implementing the fintech connector?
Well, I think you're right to highlight that, Nare. There is real potential for conflict there. The best way to avoid that and to make sure that we're all united on this is if you or the Rwanda team participate in the work stream that arises out of this call, so you can shape the direction of that, and we can in turn make sure that the direction that it's going is compatible with everything else that's happening within the Mojaloop community. Just make it a dialogue so that we work together to make sure to make sure that your requirements are met and it is compatible with the overall direction and objectives of Mojaloop. To be honest, Nari, as an adopter, you have a huge influence on this. It's you who defines the requirements. So if you're willing to participate in that work stream, your input would be extremely influential. So I think that's the best answer I can give you at the moment. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. Are there any other comments? Okay. If there are no further comments, then what I'll say is that we will establish a new work stream to explore this further. And I will seek a volunteer as a work stream lead. Is there anyone on this call who would be willing to take on that role, or should I talk to you separately after this call? If nobody volunteers now, then I will be approaching people individually. James, I assume you're not
volunteering. Can I just ask,
volunteering.
what do you think about integration? What do you
What do I
think
think
about? Well, can you hear me okay? I
Yeah.
think I've got some delay on my line. I was wondering what you think about integrating with the participation tools workstream here.
I would be very happy if you were willing to volunteer that, James, because to me it's a natural place in the participation tools. I just didn't want to overload you by adding more burdens.
Well, I think it does fit, and with yourself and Paul Baker already being strong members of that work stream, I don't want to bring in work without checking with those guys first. So yeah, I think it's a natural fit into that work stream.
It really is. I
Let's
just didn't want to overburden it.
Now let's maybe have a discussion after this. If anyone's got any other suggestions, let's have a discussion after this call. Maybe. I just want to check with the folks on the work stream who've already committed time to make sure they're okay with that before I go and make promises on their behalf.
Well, I would also encourage others on this call to join the participation tools workstream in that case. Alan, I don't know if you're a member already, but Nare, Mohammed, I'd be great if you could come and join the participation tools workstream as well.
Okay.
Yeah, not a member yet, but if we are putting this discussion there, then definitely we'll be happy to join. I'm sure our switch would second that as well.
Okay, good. Right, thank you. Okay, on that basis, is there anything else anyone wants to say before we finish this call? Any other comments? In that case, this has been recorded, so I'll make the recording available later today, and I will invite people, or James will invite people to join the participation tools workstream, and hopefully we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I'll just before we go, I'll just ping a link to the participation tools workstream Slack channel. I'll just ping a link here in the meeting chat in case anybody wants to reach out on Slack. If you want inviting to the workstream calls, just ping up on Slack and I'll forward the invite to you.
Cool. Thank you, James.
Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for all of your input. It's been a very constructive session. So thank you, and I will actually share this diagram on the participation tools Slack channel as well. So thanks, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.